In our last lesson, we talked about patterns in music. There are many kinds of patterns. Patterns in notes, like a rising line. Patterns in dynamics, like a crescendo. Patterns in rhythm, like a rhythmic motive, and so on. Musical patterns can also be multidimensional, like a rising melody combined with an orchestral crescendo. Here, the two patterns reinforce each other, creating rising tension. They could also work in the opposite direction, mitigating each other. As we will see later in the course, this can be very helpful in controlling gradations of intensity. Compare these two examples. In the first one, a sense of rising tension comes from the fact that the line mounts, combined with the crescendo. In the second example, the diminuendo attenuates the effect. The music seems to be getting more peaceful. The composer needs to look at all the dimensions of the music, not just pitch and rhythm, to make sure the desired character isn't being undermined by some other elements which contradict it. And conversely, when the effect seems too strong, sometimes a change in another dimension, as in this example, can transform the result. Another important principle in music and cognitive psychology is punctuation. Much of music's effect on us requires that we notice and remember a pattern so we can develop expectations, which the composer could then play with. But our memories aren't infinite. In fact, short-term memory usually only holds a few moments of information before we move on. With musical punctuation, the composer can write larger stretches since the punctuation breaks the flow into smaller chunks, easier to grasp and remember. To understand this, imagine the front page of a newspaper. There are headlines, columns, different size fonts, paragraphs, and so on. Imagine if all you saw was one font, no subdivisions, no visual separations, no paragraphs. It would be too much to absorb and understand. The visual organization makes it easy to find what interests you and to ignore the rest. Similarly, subdividing the musical flow into larger units makes it much easier to remember. Just as you may not remember every detail of one newspaper article on the page, but you can still remember the overall subject being treated from the title, you will notice and remember musical moments that are separated by salient punctuation. Punctuation doesn't just divide up the information into digestible chunks that are easier to remember. It also allows for hierarchy, as do the titles, fonts, paragraphs, and so on in the newspaper. In fact, music requires this even more than reading does. In reading, you can stop and go back, whereas we normally listen to music non-stop from start to finish. The varying degrees of musical punctuation give us important cues about where we are in the piece. Here's an example from Beethoven's Piano Sonata, Opus 31, number 3. Let's see how the music breaks down into smaller units. This is a sonata, not a miniature, so we expect a fair amount of contrast in a short time, not just one single idea. The contrasting motives here are neatly separated by pauses and fermatas, making the music easier to grasp. Further, the harmonic cadence at the end of the first system is more definitive than the preceding pauses, so when the music echoes the opening, starting in measure 10, we more easily recognize the repetition of a larger unit. And then, when the same cadence returns at the start of the third system, leading to a different continuation, we perceive a turning point in the form. This leads us to a fundamental notion about perception. It is not a democracy. Some things always stand out more than others. If I'm walking in the woods and I hear a bear, the bear will very quickly become the focus of my attention, since the bear could be dangerous to me. This is why evolution has made us with this tendency to break down our complex environment by degrees of salience. Of course, when we are at rest and nothing much is going on, the mind will wander. But when we are listening with full attention, we will notice some things more than others. And let's not forget that Western music is normally not monophonic. It often gives us quite a lot of information to sort out in real time. So we naturally seek out what's most salient at any given moment. This fact about perceptual hierarchy is also at the center of the most fundamental concept of orchestration, planes of tone. You can't have 100 people playing together at random without quickly sensing that it's just that, random. Good orchestration works in terms of perspective, between soloists and or groups, so the result isn't gray and monotonous, but rather a rich and varied interaction between foreground and background planes. There's a lot more to be said about these basic principles, but once you understand the basics, they will improve your compositional decisions. We'll continue our exploration of basic psychological principles in music in the next lesson.